Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can I begin by inviting Wiradyuri Elder Dinawan, Dyirribang, Uncle Bill Allen to please share an acknowledgement of country.
Yara Marang, which in Wiradyuri means good evening. I'd like to acknowledge the people of this land that we're on, which is the land of the Gadigal Eora peoples, and thank them and their ancestors for allowing us to come here. And we pay also respects to their elders, past and present, and all those elders that are emerging within their group. And so with that, I'll say Mandangua, which is thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Uncle Bill. By acknowledging country in Parliament, we aim to continue breaking down the barriers and to build trust across communities all throughout New South Wales. The Parliament of this state strives to work alongside Aboriginal people, to listen to their voices and to build a better future for everyone in this state. For those who I haven't met, my name is Ben Franklin. I'm the President of the Legislative Council in the New South Wales Parliament, and I'm one of the two presiding officers here in the Parliament alongside my good friend Greg Piper, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. 2024 marks 200 years since the first sitting of the Legislative Council, and the building that you entered through tonight is in fact the oldest continuously operating public building in the country. During our bicentenary year, we're acknowledging this significant milestone and our collective history by reflecting on our past, celebrating our achievements, and importantly, imagining the future of democracy in this state, a future that every one of you is part of. The Bicentenary Seminar Series aims to foster conversations about the valuable contribution that diverse representation has made to democracy in this state, while providing an opportunity to reflect on how we can better engage and support diverse voices into the future. But 2024 is also the 200th anniversary of another event, the declaration of martial law against Aboriginal people in Bathurst and the Central West. The bicentenary of the Legislative Council and the declaration of martial law present a really valuable and necessary opportunity to better understand how these significant events evolved and shaped New South Wales's history. As such, tonight's event is co-partnered with the History Council of New South Wales as part of New South Wales History Week. We are extremely grateful for your partnership. Thank you so much for doing this with us. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening's discussion is being live streamed and recorded. So welcome to everyone online, particularly those who are on Wiradyuri country here this evening. Tonight's seminar is titled Gudyarra. Gudyarra is the word for war in the Wiradyuri language, and it will explore the devastating impact of martial law being declared in the Bathurst and surrounding regions on the 14th of August 1824. Can I acknowledge my upper house colleagues, the Honourable Jeremy Buckingam, who is here on the panel this evening, and the Honourable Stephen Lawrence, sitting down in the front row here, both of whom moved motions in the Legislative Council in March this year, seeking a way to formally recognise the 200-year anniversary of martial law being declared and the Gudyarra during the Council's bicentenary celebrations. Can I also acknowledge all members of the Legislative Council who supported the desire for tonight's conversation to take place through their unanimous support of this motion. But I particularly want to thank the Wiradyuri elders who are here with us this evening. They have been incredible partners in creating tonight's event from its original inception. Our panellists, Uncle Bill, Uncle Jade and Aunty Leanna, as well as Lisa Patton, who is also here with us this evening. In preparing for tonight, a team from the Parliament had the honour of joining Wiradyuri elders on country in May for a really significant and meaningful day of learning. Those people who were there included myself, the Clerk of the Parliament, David Blunt AM, the Chief Executive of the Department of Parliamentary Services, Mark Webb, the Deputy Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, Carly Maxwell, the Usher of the Black Rod, Janelle Moore, the Senior Aboriginal Liaison Officer, Joe Stewart, Legislative Council colleagues, Jeremy Buckingam, Stephen Lawrence, and a whole range of senior staff. As you can see, we took that very seriously, and we wanted to send the entire senior leadership of the Parliament to understand the importance of what we were doing tonight. And representatives from the Parliament, including the Clerk and the Senior Aboriginal Liaison Officer, also attended Duloin Gudyarra. I practiced that before too, so annoying. The corroboree at Walu in Bathurst on the 14th of August this year, an incredibly special event. We here at the New South Wales Parliament are incredibly honoured by the generosity of the Wiradyuri, and we acknowledge the importance of truth-telling. It is genuinely a privilege to be here tonight, to be able to host tonight's conversation as a part of our bicentenary. And one more thing before I hand over to each of our guests to introduce themselves. Today was a significant day. Today, the New South Wales Government announced a change to the New South Wales High School history syllabus, whereas previously, colonisation in Australia were only covered in an optional depth study only in years 9 and 10. Today it's been announced that for the first time, all students in years 7 and 8 will undertake a mandatory depth study on Aboriginal people's experiences of colonisation in Australia, and it's about time. So I'd now like to ask the panellists to introduce themselves briefly and to share their connection to tonight's topic, starting with Uncle Bill.
Yeah, my name's Dinawan Dyirribang, and I'm from the Murai clan of the Bathurst Plains, which is part of the Wiradyuri Nation. And but I've also, that's through my mother's line, and through my father's line, I have connection to saltwater people from Dunghutti and Gumbaynggirr country. And that's so, and also through the Wurrumai people.
Thanks so much, Uncle Bill. Uncle Jade.
Mandangu, just want to pay my respect to Eora and Gadigal and all the other local clans. Nyonyani Yanhadarrambal, Nyonyani Nyampawan Gaiwan, Bilar Kiali, Gu Yoriora, Gu Wiradyuri Narangi. So I'm born and bred near Park Country, the Bilar people. I've also got ties into Yoriora and to the Wiradyuri through the Narangi clan. Mandangu, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yaria, Biambu, Uanadi, Wirraby, Wiradyuri, Maying Wiradyuri, Norangbang, Yinjamara Buya, Norangbang, Buye, Yinjamara, Yanana Yinjamara. So my name's Leanna Carr. I'm a proud descendant of the Wiradyuri people, and I acknowledge country and language, and we come with Yinjamara, which is respect. Do slowly, be gentle, and be polite, and have honour, and that's how we will leave. So, manangu.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Gapps, and I'm an historian, and over the last few years I've been really working on what I don't like to call frontier wars anymore, the Australian wars, the wars that we are talking about tonight.
I'm David Suttor. I'm the current owner of Brucedale, which is a property at Bathurst. My family have been there for 6 generations. So we settled in Bathurst in 1822, just before the Bathurst Wars. My ancestor, William Henry Suttor, became a friend of the Wiradyuris, under his father's instructions. So our part we didn't take part in the Aboriginal Wars. We actually gave refuge for the Aboriginal people on our property. Wiradyuri, who was our warrior at the time, he's actually buried on our property, and we take great respect in having the fact that we still own the land where he is, and his gravesite has been respected and now made a conservation area for everybody to visit.
My name is Jeremy Buckingam. I'm a member of the Legislative Council. Previously, I was an Orange City Councillor out in Wiradyuri country in the Central West, and a stonemason. In that job, I developed an understanding, a narrow one, of some of the history of the formation of our country, and as the professor says, the frontier, or sorry, the Australian Wars. and I was determined in my role here to make sure that we were committed to truth-telling about what really happened and on the frontiers and with the colonisation of Australia. So I was very keen to make sure, as part of the bicentenary of the formation of the Parliament, there was also a recognition of the other really important bicentenary, the Declaration of Martial Law, and how those two issues were intersected.
Well, thank you very much. I think you can see that we have quite an extraordinary panel with us this evening, and I know it's going to be a fascinating discussion for us all. But I'd like to begin tonight's discussion the only way that we can, and that is by putting First Nations voices first. I would like to ask the Wiradyuri elders respectfully to share the Gudyarra story with us all to frame this evening's discussion.
Yeah, so the Bathurst Wars went from about 1822 to 1824, and it was a brutal time in the history of Bathurst. So when I was going to school in Bathurst, growing up, no one ever spoke about Wiradyuri or spoke about that there was a war that happened there in the first place. All I learnt was that all the colonisers were coming over the mountains with the explorers and all these people, and they settled in Bathurst, and Bathurst became this centre of the West, and then from there everything else developed after that. And all they basically said was that, oh, there was Aboriginal people here, but they just moved away. And that's what you find in a lot of the country towns in Western New South Wales. They say the same thing and that sort of thing. So so I learnt that when I was that's what I learnt at school, that was it. But at home, I got a different history. I was told the history of our people, how we lived on country, and what we did on country, and who, I was told when I was about 8 years of age about Wiradyuri by my mother, and then I learned a bit more about him as I got older. And I learnt that a lot of other Wiradyuri people in other parts of Wiradyuri country, they all spoke of him highly too, because he was seen as a hero in our amongst our people and that. And so, like I said, I learnt more and more as time went on, and I learnt all this from speaking to my elders, speaking to other family members who knew the story, but the story was always been kept secret. So I was told not to talk about it until a certain time. And the reason why that was done was because Wiradyuri had a son that survived the massacre on the river, and sent him over to the Carr area to be not be caught up in the fighting that was happening in Bathurst. And so, like I said, as I got older, I was just learning more. And then when I got a position in national parks, I used to do talks at the schools, and so I'd be telling the story. And a couple of schools I never got invited back to because they just didn't believe that these are the stories of, and it wasn't, that it's a different history to what they were teaching. So they were only teaching about Captain Cook and the First Fleet to come out and all this sort of stuff. And so I made it basically a mission in my life to try and get this story out there. And as time went along, I've joined up with other elders, and two of them are here tonight to talk about these things that happen. And so we don't really have a lot of engagement with some of the locals in Bathurst there, because some of those families, their ancestors were involved in the atrocities that were carried out on the Wiradyuri people. And so here we live in a town like that, and also we have to live, to try and keep our presence and show our strength and our survival of that we're still here. We didn't go away. We fought for our land. We fought for our country. We fought for our families. We fought to keep our society going, which is what any people would do, being invaded by somebody. But always, Aboriginal people were always put down as the savages and all this sort of stuff, because they killed a white person. You know, so a white person's life was worth more than a black person's. And so, and that's how we paid. If one white person got killed, probably 10 of our people were killed, and that sort of thing. So these are the atrocities that happen, and it's only 200 k's over the mountains from here that this was going on in that part of the time. Yes, I'll pass on to Yana.
Thank you, Uncle. So, in Bathurst 200 years ago, even after the declaration of martial law, the desire and the bloodlust that was in the air was intense. We shouldn't be here. The three of us sitting here right here in front of you. There was a sheep grazier who said all the blacks are good for is manuring the ground with their carcasses. And he said especially you should kill the women and the children to be rid of the race. That was the mentality in Bathurst 200 years ago. And sometimes we wonder, even today, if that mentality has actually disappeared or if it still lingers. And so having conversations like the one we're having today is very important to the process of truth-telling, to the process of healing. For us to heal, we carry the scars, the mental anguish, the intergenerational trauma from the British invasion of our homelands, our country. We've never ceded our sovereignty. We haven't given it up. We haven't sold it. You can't sell your mother. And then the invaders, they carry the guilt, the intergenerational guilt of what their ancestors did. No one here was there. It's not your fault. You didn't do it. But how do you reconcile what happened to us and the intergenerational trauma that we live with and the intergenerational wealth that you have? Think about that.
Yeah. And I think that my contribution to this conversation is around the women and children. The person that Yana was talking about, his name was William Cox. And when where we live in Bathurst, we have to drive across that swampland where that massacre happened. And it was the women and children that suffered. And as part of that declaration of martial law, the last paragraph of it, or the last few sentences, was that the women and children they weren't to be harmed. They were leave them alone. And that didn't happen. So truth-telling is really important for us. And in our language, we call that Gudyarra Dyirribang. Talk straight and tell the truth. And this year being the 200-year declaration of the martial law, we've had to stand in that truth just a few weeks ago, and we called it Dyirribang. And Dyirribang is the next part of that process as part of our buye, part of our law, which is standing in that truth. And that was a pretty heavy week for us because that was 200 years in the making. And with that, we needed to tell the truth and talk straight. And it's a part of the hidden history of this country and a part of the hidden history of this nation and how it was built. And I think that the people who came out and supported Dyirribang were pretty brave to sit in that space with us. We talked straight and we told the truth. There's not many familiar faces here, like in the crowd, but there'll be definitely lots on the screen in the live that are out on country listening to this. So I think that for us and for healing to happen and for us to have a restorative future, we need to talk about what happened to the first peoples of this land. And like my brother says, we never ceded our sovereignty, and we have survived.
Yeah, just to add to that, as in not ceding our land, which means we never ceded our title to our land. Yeah, our title to our land is still there. It's just that the invaders come over and put their land titles over our land and took the land. Like Yana said, the land was never ever sold to anyone. So the land that the people are living on today, they're living on stolen land, as we say. And, prove that you own it. You've got to have a bill of sale to show that you own something. Well, none of that, no one's showing us that about our land. So we are still fighting our country. We're still fighting to protect it. But we don't fight with the spears now. We fight through legislation. And it's legislation written by white people. And because sometimes we beat them in their own law, they don't like it. And then they want to change the rules and the laws that govern our rights to be able to protect our country. And that's the fight that we're still having today, not just here in Wiradyuri country, but right across the country. This happens for Aboriginal people.
Thank you so much for your extraordinary generosity in sharing your perspective about the last incredibly difficult 200 years. Stephen, if I could turn to you now. In 2021, you published a history of the resistance warfare by the Wiradyuri, and Gudyarra followed on from your award-winning book, The Sydney Wars, Conflict in the Early Colony, 1788 to 1817, which explored the first years of the conflict in the first years of colonial Sydney. Can you tell us about the historical record and the sources of information about the Gudyarra in the lead up to the declaration of martial law and its aftermath and your perspective as a historian on these issues?
Yeah, sure. But first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners that we're gathered here tonight. And also I want to acknowledge the elders and thank them for their guidance and inspiration over the last few years of working in that Central West area. It's been incredible. In terms of history, as an historian, I guess the first thing is that it's surprising that there's a lack of historical information about many of these events. Perhaps it's not surprising to some. But there is information, and there is all sorts of different sources. And first and foremost, as an historian, the thing to acknowledge is the traditional knowledge and the knowledge held by ancestors and descendants of both sides of the conflict. Alongside that, as an historian, you tend to look at the colonial records, the letters, the diaries, the accounts, that sometimes are a bit sketchy, but sometimes they pinpoint with alarming accuracy about the events that occurred. And I always think of ex-Sergeant Tom Miller's statement, who in his recollections, often people, squatters and settlers, don't talk about these events until much after. And his recollections said that he was ordered to go out with an armed party and to kill Aboriginal people left, right and centre. And he said that he was told to shoot young and old, big and little, men and women. So there it is in historical black and white information about some of the events. Of course, there is a lack of information as well. And it's surprising that the British colony, the commander, the commandant at Bathurst, and even the Governor Brisbane at the time, failed to write detailed written reports about what occurred at Bathurst. And this is an ongoing project. And as an historian, I write a work about the history of the Bathurst War, and I write it as an invitation for other people to find those sources, to tell those stories, to add to that picture. History is not finished. There's a long way to go. So yes, that's...
You mentioned that sometimes the sources are a bit sketchy. And so what can you perhaps talk a little bit more about what appears from my research to be a lack of historical resources at some of the most critical moments in this history?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the fact that the commandant at Bathurst, Morissette, came into Sydney and gave a verbal report to the Governor about what happened. Now, he should have had a written report, and we don't know if that exists. We are still searching for any reports like that. Governor Brisbane was ordered to write a report. We haven't seen that about events, what occurred at Bathurst. Other written sources, diaries and letters, we need to find those. We need to find more of those.
Do you think they're still potentially out there to be discovered?
Yes. Yeah. And there are some, but of course, much of them don't pinpoint where things happened or how many people were killed. So we're still, in some ways, vague about what happened, but we know it happened, and we know there's enough information to say that, you know, roughly what events occurred and where and how and to what effect.
One of the things that Stephen talks about in his book is the role that animals played, that cows and sheep and horses had in the conflict. And he describes those animals as the advance guard of colonisation itself. I'd be fascinated to hear from the elders what your views are of the animals' imprint on your country, those animals.
Yeah, so from our perspective, I suppose I'd say, is that the animals that were important to us were the native animals that were around. And then when the colonisers came with their sheep, cattle and horses, that displaced a lot of the land where our native animals have been living and eating and also feeding for us, because we managed the land in such a way and farmed the land in such a way that we didn't need fences and things like that. We did it through controlled burn-offs and that sort of thing, burning different parts of country so that regenerated plants, which was food for different animals, but it was also for us to go and find different plants to eat ourselves and that sort of thing. So when the sheep and cattle come in, all that disappeared from the grazing, because when they came over the mountains and they got to what we call Browns Hill, just up in the mountains from Bathurst there, as you come into Bathurst on the Great Western Highway, you see these wide open plains, and they seen how good it looked, and that's, you know, so to them, this was good grazing cattle, good grazing land for their animals. But the thing was that we managed it in such a way that it was for our animals, and the native animals that lived there. So it had a big impact in that it displaced all those native animals then, which in turn then took away our food source, what we used to go for. And so the only other sustenance we could get was going killing sheep and cattle. And so then that's what's caused the conflict between black and white, because they both had different views and ideas on how you manage the land. So there was no understanding of how we used the land and that. And so, like I said, with Europeans coming in, they fenced off areas, and that's their plot of land. If you go in there, you're trespassing. Whereas with us, we had a similar sort of thing, but there was a mechanism put in place so that you can walk on country and go to different parts of country, so that you weren't offending other people walking on their country. So ours was more of an open sort of thing for people and looked after people, because everybody needs water and food and that sort of thing. And so when people came on our country, they were able to go and get that. But none of that could take place anymore. So when a lot of the conflict was going on, it actually displaced our people in doing ceremony. So ceremonies were interrupted, which was the bringing of, particularly for boys and girls, they were going into their adulthood to go through their ceremonies to make them into men and women. You know, so all that disappeared through just the bringing in of those type of animals and that sort of thing. And like I said, it just caused conflict and that sort of thing. So that's where you hear the accounts like what Stephen's found in his research and that you know, there was no real accountability of who killed Wiradyuri people. I've met one family whose property goes back to first colonisation back in 1821. they contacted us and said they were sorry for what their ancestors had done, and that because they did research on their family and found that their ancestor and two of the workers that worked on their property back in 1821 were charged for killing 3 Aboriginal women, Wiradyuri women. But the thing was that they were found not guilty, and they were let go. So this sort of split their family because of the history of what they found. And, so we're doing a bit of a healing with them, talking about this, So that's what I mean. The whole thing is all connected. It's not separate to what anything happened. It's all part of a big web of things that happened. And so, yeah.
The interconnected. Sorry, Leanna, please.
The only other thing that I wanted to add to that was the environmental impact that it had, because they brought in the cattle that had hooved feet, like the soles of their feet were like hooves. So it was compacting the country, and that's a part of that colonisation, I suppose, and the way that the animals brought in, and the desecration that happened to, for us, to Dyirribang, because the native animals that our ancestors and what we feast on had soft feet. So you need to think about it like that. And also Darwin was out there, and in his recount and in his and parts of his stories that he had written about was that he described it like God's country, the beauty of it, and that's exactly what it was for us. It was Wiradyuri and Dyirribang to us. So just the difference in the two types of animals was it wasn't sustainable for us either.
No, and when you add the building of these barriers, in terms of the agricultural methods that Uncle Bill was describing, that in itself would have been perceived as an aggressive act because of the destruction of the way that the Wiradyuri had utilised the land previously.
Also, hello? Yeah, it was, so like I said, it interrupted our travel for different things. So where fences and barriers were put up, that was blocking some of our song lines, which we used for ceremony. Also, it blocked our walking tracks where we walked along to go from one place to the other. And when you look at the roads that are built right across this state, and the roads that go over the mountains, they're all following our original tracks. So the Great Western Highway is still used for trading and travelling across today, as it was for tens of thousands of years. So what you've all learned at school about those 3 fellas going across the mountains is all lies, They didn't find their way. The Dyirribang people put them on the right track because there's no signs to say, Bathurst this way, And so, and like I said, and a lot of the towns and roads where we drive, they're all following our tracks. So, and anybody who goes walking in the Blue Mountains, a lot of those are our tracks originally, because when the white people came here, there was nothing here. There was no towns or nothing. What they perceived where they came from, and so a lot of the towns are built where Aboriginal people had camped, and that sort of thing. So that's how the towns all sprung up. And within our town in Bathurst, part of the town itself, the main street and the main business district area, is all built on a song line that goes from there, from down near the river, all the way up to the university and up to Wiradyuri, which is Mount Panorama. And that was one of our song lines where our young boys followed to do different things. So the thing that you look at is when they came across the mountains, on the western side of the river, when Macquarie came, that was prohibited for any civilians to come there. And what they did, the British were doing, was going to find where all our sacred places were, or places that were of significance for us. And when you look at the town of Bathurst, we know that they've built on top of some of our sacred areas. Things were part of our ceremonies to take place. So this all connects into that, to the not just the animals coming and destroying the land, but also how the invaders came and did things to, because that's what an invader does. They seek out all the institutions that people have got set up and destroy them and put their own institutions up. And that's what's happened right across this country. But particularly in Wiradyuri country, we know where they built things is what was there, what we knew what was there first.
Well, let me now focus on one of those people. And Stephen, you've in your research talked about the role of Major William Stewart, and I wonder if you can. We talk about intersecting histories and the intersection between Gudyarra and the 200th anniversary of the bicentenary. Major Stewart had a connection, obviously, with both, and I wonder if you could elucidate that a little.
So Major Stewart basically arrives in the colony to become the lieutenant, the second in charge, Lieutenant Governor. Now, he arrives in late 1824, early 1825. He's a military man through and through, as many of the colonisers were at the time. Most of the squatters, many of the free settlers, all military men through and through. What I think the importance of the connection with Stewart, so he becomes part of the Legislative Council as the second in charge to the Governor. I think the importance of what Stewart was brought out here for was to establish a mounted police force, which is what it became, known as Stewart's Police. It's a colonial cavalry. For 20 years, the governor and others had been calling for some sort of cavalry force. So in the warfare around Bathurst, they had infantry with a few magistrates and officers who were mounted, and they struggled to find and catch up with Wiradyuri and his warriors. So one of the effects of the Bathurst War was the introduction of the mounted police into Australia. And if you know anything about the later history of the mounted police, they are involved in the Hunter Valley Wars, in the Liverpool Plains, the massacre at Waterloo Creek. They are soldiers. They're a paramilitary force in the colony. So the first mounted police are taken from the soldiers who were the British infantry who were stationed in the colony at the time. And they do that for decades. So the soldiers on horseback acting as police, but effectively a paramilitary force on the frontier. And Stewart is the commander of that, at the same time as being second in charge and part of the council.
You know, it's tough, these understanding this history, because as human beings, it's easier for us to understand history when we can look at it from the perspective of individuals, when we can see the example of individuals and see how they have interacted with the world around them and the actions that they have perpetuated or that they've taken part in. You mentioned Wiradyuri. I have to say that the very first conversation I had with Jeremy Buckingham about this issue, which was almost literally a day or two after I was elected into the presidency, he came to speak to me about this, was to talk about Wiradyuri and his extraordinary legacy, something you mentioned in your speech to the Legislative Council as well. Jeremy, tell us why Wiradyuri is such an important figure and why he's obviously so important to you in terms of understanding this whole period and Gudyarra in general.
Can I just jump in there really quickly? Sorry, Jeremy. The New South Wales Mounted Police Force, is that not the same police force, mounted police force that was started 200 years ago?
Yes, it is. So Stewart's Police was committed in 1825, the beginning of 1825. Yes, it is.
Okay, and they have a bicentenary coming up as well.
Yes, that's right.
And we're talking about the New South Wales Mounted Police.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, just to clear that up. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate that. And I've got to say at the beginning, it's very intimidating. It's a massive honour and privilege to be speaking about Wiradyuri. I'm very nervous about it, especially with the elders here. But Wiradyuri, I think, is one of the most important historical and cultural figures in Australia. I think for those who know who he was and what he stood for, well, you'd agree totally. But it's a tragedy that everyone in Australia doesn't know the story of his resistance, his bravery, and also his humanity. Wiradyuri was a young man when the explorers first got over the Blue Mountains, and so he would have been born in and around 1800. He watched as the whites came, the cattle and sheep spread out across his country, and reports are that initially the Wiradyuri were concerned, but thought that it was something that they could probably tolerate and live with. But as the stock numbers grew, as the atrocities, especially against Aboriginal women, became more frequent, Wiradyuri as the Wiradyuri as a Wiradyuri warrior and leader started to fight back, and he started to rally his people through councils of war and organise a very effective guerrilla resistance against the most dominant military on planet Earth at that time. The British at that point had conquered most of the world, had just won the Napoleonic Wars, and these were the world's best soldiers with the best equipment, and he was up against, and his warriors were up against a very, very effective fighting force, and they fought back effectively. And so you see from the reports that Stephen has so carefully put in the Gudyarra, and that I've learnt about from the Wiradyuri elders, and I thank them for sharing their knowledge. He and his warriors led a resistance against the invasion with scores of battles and skirmishes against the settlers, the stock keepers, and also against the military force that was now stationed and growing in Bathurst. And he was a formidable character. Incredibly formidable character, and his reputation spread very quickly around the colony. He was described. He was captured. By 1824, there was essentially open warfare in the Bathurst region. He was captured in 1825, and the Sydney Gazette said that it took 6 men and to bring him to the ground. They had to break 2 muskets over him to subdue him, and he was described as having a noble countenance, a piercing eye, was a very fine figure, and a good model for Apollo or Hercules. And he was noted for his sobriety and affection for his family and kinsmen. He was arrested, he was taken to Bathurst, and he was chained to a tree in irons for a month, and treated incredibly poorly. He was treated incredibly poorly, and that, I think, was a formative lesson for him. When he was released, he then, on the basis of the continuing atrocities against his people and massacres, he went to war. There's no other way to describe it. And he led an incredible resistance against the British Empire and the expansion. There was an incident in 1824 that's called the Potato Field incident or massacre, in which he saw his wife, his children, his nieces shot and massacred in front of him. And from that point on, you can see that he was determined to push back in every single way he could. But he also had incredible humanity, and I'm sure David's going to talk about this. He was, I think, motivated by justice. That's what he was doing. He was fighting for his country. He understood the threat, the existential threat that the British posed, the cattle posed. but he was also fighting for justice. So he treated people who treated him with decency also. And there was the incredible story of how he, after fighting and killing some settlers who had poisoned Wiradyuri women and children, he had spared the ancestor of David Suttor here, William Henry Suttor, who went on to be a member of the Legislative Council, because William Henry Suttor had learnt some Wiradyuri language, was able to talk to Wiradyuri and explain to him that they should be friends, and they did become friends. And so Wiradyuri was an incredibly powerful figure. He should sit in our cultural understanding of who we are, as other great figures in history do in other countries, like Sitting Bull or Gandhi, these resistance leaders. He was amazing. And if I've said a fair bit, but can I just read something that was said about him when he was eventually led a band of Wiradyuri into Bathurst after the declaration of martial law. He led a band of Wiradyuri into Parramatta after the declaration of martial law and the attacks on his people, and he essentially sued for peace with the governor, wearing a hat that said peace with an olive branch in the head. He led a band of 140 Wiradyuri down to meet Governor Brisbane. He met with Governor Brisbane, and then after that went back home, and the war had subsided. But when he died after a tribal conflict in 1829, David's ancestor, George Suttor, wrote an obituary for the Wiradyuri chieftain in the Sydney Gazette, which in 1829, which was remarkable. And in part it says, he, Wiradyuri, surrendered and was introduced to Sir Thomas Brisbane at Parramatta, where he excited a great deal of curiosity. He resided a short time in the Domain, and the kindness shown to him there seemed to have operated on his mind in favour of the colonists. For ever since he has avoided committing any acts of violence to them, though it may be supposed his high and independent spirit felt uneasy at times at seeing his country possessed by the white fellows, as the Aborigines call us. It is to be lamented that the imprudence and too often cruelty of the Europeans has heretofore given too much cause for revenge amongst the native tribes. And the letter concludes with, Homo sum humani nihil a me alien puto. I am human, nothing human is alien to me. So I think a profound bit of humanity.
Yeah. Just to add to Jeremy's comments there, so Wiradyuri's wife and eldest son were killed, but he had a younger son who was only a little toddler at the time. He survived, and Wiradyuri got him and sent him over towards where Carr is today, to where the Wiradyuri people that lived along the Gudyarra, which is the Lachlan River. So that's where he stayed and grew up there. And so he used to come back to Bathurst every so often when he got older, and to walk on country and all that sort of thing. But also with him dying from a wound from a tribal fight, the tribal fight was over with a fellow by the name of Gudyarra. Now Gudyarra was a Wiradyuri warrior, but he was a traitor. So he fed information to the British on where the next attacks were going to be done by Wiradyuri. And so Wiradyuri found out all this and confronted him. This is in about 1829, and confronted him over it. And so they did a duel of throwing spears, and Wiradyuri copped a spear in the leg, and he was then taken to the Bathurst military hospital that was set up at that time. But he ended up walking out after a few days and went back home, back out to country, back home where Brucedale is today, and then his warriors out there then gave him the proper burial rituals that our people used to carry out. And so that's just a little bit extra information from what Jeremy was talking about.
Thank you. It's an extraordinary story, and David, of course, you have the great responsibility of having Windradine's grave in your home. The sort of the relationship that Jeremy described about the Suttors in the 1800s and the Wiradyuri is really quite extraordinary. And I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about that relationship and the impact that it's had on your family.
Well, I'm lucky that I can say that, like proudly, that with the elders here today, I stand with them with everything that sort of happened. Like with the Deloitte thing in Bathurst, like that was a fantastic sort of episode that we've been through. But for the pride of my family, that we actually weren't involved in any of the tragedies that happened. So George Suttor was a free settler who came to Australia in 1800, and he had a different view to most other colonists at the time. That he arrived in Australia, he took up a first block of land out of Borkham Hills where he had an orchard. He'd bought plants out from England that Sir Joseph Banks thought would help the colony. So he was actually sponsored out here by Sir Joseph Banks. So when he settled on that land, like there were Aboriginal people on that land, but he didn't actually ask them to leave, so they were able to come back onto their land even though George was there with his family. So George stayed like at Borkham Hills there for quite a while. He was a successful orchardist there. He grew the first commercial crop of oranges like in the colony. And then after Bathurst was discovered, they'd heard about all this sort of land further west looking to sort of grow their sort of enterprise, I guess you'd say, because he had a big family, like he had 13 kids, and of that 11 of them were boys. So you sort of think, well, something's got to happen. So for the William was only 17 when they got to Bathurst, so they arrived in Bathurst in you had to get a license to go to Bathurst. You couldn't just cross the mountains. No one was allowed just to cross the mountains. It was all controlled. So they applied for a license. They got that in 1822, but by the time they got organised to get over there, they turned up in Bathurst in March 1823. So the block of land they thought they were going to have was meant to be in town on the river flats, but they could never find that block of land. So George left William, who was 17, out at Bathurst. So there weren't many white people in Bathurst, a lot of Aboriginal people in Bathurst. And George's instructions to William were, make friends with the local Aboriginals, and if you do, you won't have any problems. So you'll be treated well if you treat them well. So William obviously took that to heart. So he did learn some Wiradyuri language. I can't imagine that he could speak it fluently, because I hear Leanna and Jade and Bill talking, you go, yep, I should learn some, but it's it'd be like learning a foreign language. So, but when you're 17, and if you're actually communicating with another, race of people or another nationality, you do actually learn how to communicate. So they actually became friends, in that early piece. Eventually, it was, I'm sort of assuming that, with the friendship of Wiradyuri, that where we are at Brucedale, I would imagine Wiradyuri might have said to William, I know where there's some nice land. Because the early colonists were looking for rivers and the creek flats, because they're the most fertile soil. So we're 10 miles out of Bathurst, which, is in those days was quite a distance. So there's a beautiful place where we are, it's got 2 creeks running into it, where Wiradyuri's buried. It's just up off the flat, so it's out of flood range and everything else like that. And I would imagine that was sacred ground to the Aboriginals, because Wiradyuri's not the only person buried in that site. There's at least 2 other grave sites that we know of within that site. So I think the reason for that site being chosen is there's a water hole in the creek that, even in all the droughts that we've been through lately, has always had water in it. So it's a permanent water. As Bill said, food and water are the most important things to humans. So the Wiradyuri knew that was a good water hole, that it was always there no matter how dry it got. So with my family, I'm proud to say that we weren't involved in the tragedies that happened. That my ancestors made friends with Wiradyuri, and that's continued today. Like before Bill, there was another elder in Bathurst, John Bugg. He was the one who sort of really alerted me, outside of my family story, to the Aboriginal side more of the story, and because of John Bugg's involvement and then with Bill's involvement, that's what made us sort of say, well, we have to protect this site so as it's there forever. So if anything ever happened to the property and it's sold, like it's been in my family now for 6 generations, there's, you know, my son is keen to take it on. The next generation, you know, they've got a child, hopefully he'll take it on. So we've got that connection with the land like these guys. So, you know, I'm only looking at sort of, you know, 6th generation myself, out to 7. But as Leanna said, you know, like, well, how long have you got to be there till you're local? Like, they've been there for thousands of years. We're 200. We're not quite local yet, you know, like, so we're hoping they'll sort of say we are local, you know, like 200 years we're getting there, hopefully. But it's really nice that we've got this relationship, and it's fostering the relationship between one another, and it's continuing. And we want to make sure that the story gets out, that there were a lot of tragedies that happened in that time, but there was, you know, it's not all tragedy. There are some good stories that come from it. And the best part about all of this is that we're actually educating everyone to watch what happened. Like, the number of schools that are interested in it now is just extraordinary. And every time we get there, like, I don't want to do it by myself. I always want to have the elders there so there's 2 sides of the story, because there's no point having it one side. It has to be both sides. So it's really important that whenever these school groups come, that, you know, we've got sort of both sides there. And the kids are getting really involved in it, which is such a great thing to see. And like, as Ben said tonight, that, you know, like now the syllabus is actually back to year 7. They have to learn about early Australian history. It's a fantastic thing, because we really do need to learn about it. So tonight here, I mean, there's quite a few people here tonight. You've heard, you know, 2 sides of the story now. I'm just glad that I can say my side is a positive side, and it's positive going forward. So we've never restricted any access to the gravesite. It's open to the public. It's just that it's in a spot that it's a little bit hard to access, which is actually quite good in the sense that, you know, we can control what happens to it. And it's only that, you know, if you get bogged on that granite country around Bathurst, you can be there for a long time and no one will come and get you, because you know, everyone knows that if, well, that vehicle's bogged, it's really soft. So, and we've got a creek that we have to cross to get to the gravesite. So that's one of the hard parts at the moment, you know, trying to get these kids on site to the gravesite. When you're actually at the gravesite, it actually means more than just hearing about it, even if we're at the homestead, talking about it at the homestead. Even though you're close, you're not quite there. So in Deloyne, the Bathurst Historical Society corrected just a historical fact on the gravesite. There's a can that was put up there in 1956, which was probably a very unusual thing in Australian history, that an Aboriginal site was, you know, on private property was recognised. But they had the date of Wiradyuri's death incorrect. And so on the first weekend of the Deloyne, the Historical Society put a new plaque up with the correct date of death of Wiradyuri on that can. And there was over 100 people from Bathurst came out to the gravesite to witness that. And that was a capped audience. We couldn't actually get any other people there. And mainly because of access. So you know, you can't get buses to it. So we had to have, you know, people just ferried over in 4-wheel drives. So, and by the end of the day, like, people were getting bogged getting out. So we're just really lucky that we're able to do it. So, you know, it's been a special thing to be involved in all of this. And to the credit of my early ancestors, that they actually had the right attitude to move into another country.
One of the things I love, David, in what you've just said is the increasing engagement, particularly from young people, about learning about truth and learning about the stories of their nation, the history of their nation. I want to pull back the focus just a little bit, and one of the things that these wars, these frontier wars, I know you don't like to use that term anymore, Stephen, but they've been represented as sort of a localised conflict between a small group of Aboriginal people and the British colonists. But in fact, that wasn't the case. You talk in your book, Stephen, about the fact that there were large war bands which were drawn from, a whole range of Aboriginal groups and nations, including women, to come together to fight against the invaders. And I'd be interested in your views about how this shifts our understanding about the conflict, and then I'd love to hear from the elders about the alliances that were forged through the Gudyarra. Stephen.
Sure, but just before that, can I just say, going back to historical sources we were talking about before, that the Suttor family it still remains to this day one of the key historical sources, one of the key families, the few Europeans who actually were a conscience of the colony at the time. The Suttor was writing to the newspapers and saying, what is going on? There's massacres happening in Bathurst. No one else was. So I just wanted to really acknowledge that, David.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. So, well, that would be from George, and like George, he was a humanitarian. So, like, he had a different attitude to so many other people.
But in terms of broader conflicts, it's something that I'm actually, that studying the Bathurst War, the first Wiradyuri War of Resistance, has led me to look into in greater detail, which is what military historians and others have said in the past, that different nations couldn't ally with each other. Different groups were traditional enemies and they wouldn't fight together. And that's long been a narrative in Australian history about the resistance wars, why they couldn't succeed, why they couldn't push the British out. I don't think it's correct at all. There's thank you. There's compelling evidence there when you scratch the surface and when you talk to elders about the alliances. I mean, I'm coming across where traditional enemies, so-called traditional enemies, put down their arguments and fought against the colonisers. So just around Bathurst, you've got all these different Wiradyuri groups who came together. But in later frontier wars, you've actually got different nations from hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of kilometres uniting in a fight back against the push of the squatters that occurs after the success of the colonisation of Bathurst into the 1830s, where the pastoral expansion occurs. There's an incredible pushback by alliances of different Aboriginal groups right across that so-called frontier.
Yeah, and what I want to add to that too is that we were allied nations for 60,000 years. So I'm going to bust that myth straight away, brother. Yeah, and Wiradyuri people, like our warriors, knew about what happened down here on Eora Nation because they had Wiradyuri as our head warrior and head lawman for the Gunigal Maying Wiradyuri Dyirribang Plains country. Had received a message stick from Pemaway. So, like from our oral history, we know that that stuff is probably, well, it is untrue from our perspective. And if you haven't worked it out, Wiradyuri is the biggest nation with the largest people population, and our second biggest nation in New South Wales is Gomeroi, and we are allied nations. And Wiradyuri influenced a lot of the other nations around us. So I, for one, will dispute that. And, we, in our part of country where our ancestors come from, so Wiradyuri, Wollambira and Warramundi, which is Yanna and Yanna's ancestor and mine, who were also head warriors. Our sacred mountain, Walu, is where all of that trading happened. So, there's still lots to be told about that history.
And also adding to it about the alliances that the Wiradyuri had with other nation groups around them, which included the Wanneroo in the Hunter Valley, the Yuin down the south coast, some of the Eora groups, and also up the north coast. Wiradyuri's first wife actually came from Dungutty country, which is up near Kempsey, and she was a bit older than him, but she went back to Bathurst with him, And so there's a connection with the Dunghutti people through Wiradyuri that I've also found out about, because I've known them for years, this family up in Kempsey, and then we find out that they got a link to Wiradyuri. But also he had a younger wife that came from Bundjalung country up near the border of Bundjalung and Gumbaynggirr country, which is up between Grafton and Coffs Harbour. And so because of that, all those people knew about Wiradyuri too. And that was because of in his earlier years, when he was got finally initiated and all that, his role then had to be training to be the head warrior. And so over those years before he settled down in the Bathurst area, was that he had to go to some of those places and introduce himself to those people. And so they knew who he was. When the wars actually started, he called on them to come and fight. And when they walked into Parramatta to call a truce to the fighting, the 140 warriors weren't just all Wiradyuri. A lot of them were from those other nation groups, Gomeroi, Dunghutti, Gumbaynggirr, Dunghutti, Worimi, Yuin, all those different nation groups all along the eastern part of New South Wales. And so that's the influence that he had, and the stories about him that went far and wide. So it's not just a local story for us in Bathurst. He's a main figure at that time, and even today when we talk about people leading a resistance and that. And when he turned up to the Suttors with young William, they actually didn't go there to kill him or anything. They went there to ask him to show them how to use the muskets, because they'd captured muskets off the British and they wanted to know how to use them. And so because of their friendship with young William, they thought they'd ask him. But he couldn't show them, because if he did, the rest of the white population in Bathurst would have known that he would have taught them. But there was also a bit of a problem with that, even if the Wiradyuri did learn how to use them. They didn't have a supply network of the shots and the gunpowder they needed for the muskets. So basically they were useless to us and that sort of thing. So, so that's why they had to develop a different type of warfare, which they developed guerrilla type warfare.
Can I just add another bit?
Please.
That just prior to the declaration of martial law, and a lot of people are disparaging about, some people have been disparaging about describing the Gudyarra as a real war, but prior to the declaration of martial law, it was reported in the Sydney Press that the Wiradyuri and Wiradyuri were leading a band of hundreds of Wiradyuri warriors. Now, I imagine that, and I think that would be a very fierce thing to be confronting, and the importance of the expansion of the colony into Wiradyuri country was so important that at that time the press were reporting it as something must be done, because it exposes, this was a quote, it exposes the colony to ruin. That unless they expanded, they'd run out of good agricultural land on the coast. There was not much anyway, that if the colony was to survive, they had to invade and take over this land. And if you look at the quality of soldier that the British decided to send up against the Wiradyuri, they sent probably the best soldier in the British Army. Major William Stewart had served in a revolt in Jamaica, a slave revolt in Jamaica, suppressing that. He'd fought in wars in Canada. He'd fought in the Peninsular Wars, and he was a specialist. He was Wellington's cavalry officer in the Peninsular Wars, who actually formed the first Guerrero battalion to fight, like fast-moving cavalry, to fight the guerrillas, the Guerreros, the cowboys that they were fighting in the Peninsular Wars. He fought at Waterloo. He went to India. He was not someone who was retiring. He was one of the most fierce and effective soldiers in the most fierce and effective armies in the world, and they sent him out here to deal with the Wiradyuri because they were resisting under the leadership of Windradine. And the last thing I'll say, and when we're talking about monuments, outside of Bathurst, the reason I first became aware of this is as a stonemason, I was once asked to go and look at a monument that sits on the hill up behind Bathurst. And it's actually William Stewart's grave. And it's up on the top of Mount Pleasant. And it's in a gigantic, massive stone plinth. Huge, massive, like 4 metres high. And it says Lieutenant Governor, Major General William Stewart. He was actually the governor for a couple of weeks at one time. And it's up on a hill behind this enormous house that his family built. And it's abandoned. It's abandoned. It's ruined. And I think it sort of says a lot about our history, that we've tried to hide some of our history, the history of Windradine, the Wiradyuri, but also our own history. One of our own governors has got an abandoned grave sitting up on a hill behind Bathurst. And I think that the expansion that happened beyond Bathurst was codified in that conflict and had incredibly devastating implications for the rest of Aboriginal Australia.
This has been a fascinating discussion, but I'd like to spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about both the present and the future. This week is History Week, and the theme for History Week is marking time. Gudyarra in the Wiradyuri language means speak the truth. And we are at an important juncture this year, right now, with these 2 bicentenaries providing a really important opportunity to imagine the future of both what an inclusive parliamentary democracy looks like, but also what an inclusive state looks like going forward. And so we've been through a lot over the last year and a half, but I'd be very interested to know from the elders how important truth-telling is to taking these steps forward into the future. And I think that many Australians hear the term truth-telling and they don't perhaps understand the depth of what it actually means. And I would love for you to give us your views.
Thank you, Mandangul. It all starts with education that's starting to happen in the syllabus, the IATSIS resources that are out there. But what we've really got to ask ourselves is, are we comfortable that we have dispossessed a people and stolen their land and impacted on them irreversibly while we live a good life as healthy individuals with prosperity in the lucky country? Are we comfortable that these people have not been compensated in any way? There's been no reparations. There's been no land given back. In fact, the situation gets worse. Look at the numbers for incarceration, health stats, housing stats, and the rest of it. Are we, as Australians and people from New South Wales, comfortable with this?
Yeah, so, it's about, and the only way, like you said, the only way we can sort of teach this is through education. Start telling the other side of the story, because there's only one side of the story that's ever been taught in this country. And the truth-telling is something that has to come out, and it's got to be done by both sides, because we can't move forward as a nation because we have the same issues coming up every year about Australia Day, about NAIDOC, about Sorry Day, all these things. And people are sort of, in a way, sick of hearing them. But some of these things just don't get to the point of what really needs to be done. They've got reconciliation, but to us that's the wrong word. There was no relationship there in the first place to repair, So reconciliation is the wrong term that's been used. So the thing that we need to do, like I said, is we've got to talk it out. So it's like your own family. If there's somebody hiding a secret in the family, You all want to find out what the truth is, and get it out in the air, because otherwise it just splits the family. And that's what's happening with Australia as a family. We are split because no one's talking about the things that happened in the past on how this nation was actually built. It was built by convicts who were basically slaves that were brought out here, and then they weren't even treated well. So when we seen that happening, we knew that they weren't going to treat us well, So we have to talk about it so that that way we can heal together and then move forward to become a country that is comfortable in the things that happened in our past. Germany's going through all that, since 1945. They've had to face up to the atrocities that affected the whole world. Every country goes through where somebody's come and invaded them. And so there's no point keeping it a secret, because it happened. Like we say, shit happens, And so that's, so we have to be growing up now. Australia's still hanging on the coattails of England, That's why they keep the Union Jack there in the flag, to show that where they came from. It doesn't show that we were here before all of that. And so there's a lot of things that need to be reflected on and talked about in this country so that we can move forward and, all those sorts of things. So that's one of the things that I think that should happen.
One of the ways that you did that, of course, this year, recently, was through the Dyirribang corroboree, an extraordinary event. In fact, the event that's pictured up on the screen. What was it like? Tell us a little bit about it and how it felt to mark this 200-year anniversary since the declaration of martial law in this way.
It's a big story to tell. It's 200 years old, this story, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and I think that the last couple of years, it's sort of 2024 came really quickly for us because we're educators in our own rights, and with that we do a lot of community service and a lot of work for our community, and through that work, like we actually work with schools and universities and lots of different public and private organisations. The Dyirribang project for us, and that's what we decided to call it, was pretty important for us to acknowledge our ancestors and remember our old people and the warriors and the allied nations that stood with us 200 years ago, especially our Apical ancestors. And I think that it didn't make everyone happy, especially in our community, because Bathurst being the oldest inland city, on the other side of the west of, the mountains here, people made really, the trolls, they come out, they're horrible. The part about this was we used our own money. Just want to make that really clear to everybody. We reached into our own pockets. We also applied for lots of grants, and we were successful with most of them. And we decided as a corporation and as elders that we wanted to make this event free, not just for our people, but for everyone in our community to be to participate in Dyirribang. So it was a whole week of events, and everything was free. And thanks to our volunteers, it wouldn't have happened without anybody, especially us. We wouldn't have been able to do it without them, and the support of our local community. So the most probably significant for me, I think it was at Wiradyuri, and that's the image you can see behind you. Is it still up? Yeah, that's this is the celebration site up at Wiradyuri on our sacred mountain, and this is where the warriors went to after they went through initiation. So I made it really clear to the audience that night, we did, that our ancestors haven't danced on this country for 200 years. They have not had a corroboree on this ground for 200 years. So we wanted to make it really clear to everyone there that that night it was lots of different emotions for all of us, but for us it's the honour part of our law, and that night was pretty incredible for us, and to be able to be there like with each other but also with our family and our community, and it was really special that day, because the night before, this is Bathurst weather too, don't ever come to Bathurst without a jumper, people. Even if it's summer and it says 47 degrees, bring a jumper. Yes. But we were up at...
Same page there, Leanna.
I know, yeah. And so the night before, it just rained. It rained cats and dogs, and I was just like, this rain. And then we got up the next morning and it's still raining. So we moved everyone down for final practice downtown. And then we was like, oh, you know, bugger it, we just got to get up there the mountain, like we'll just get up here to Walu, because we have to dance on country. It's really important. It's a part of our healing. It's part of this restorative part of our law that we need to, we need to participate in. So we got up there, and it rained a little tiny bit. Then the clouds just opened up, and then the sun came out, and it was really, really special. You know, it's like our ancestors. We say cleanse country. You know, they cleared country for us, and they protected country, and they cleared all of that space for us. And we were honoured to do that, like I said, for our especially our Apical ancestors, the warriors that we descend from, but also for our community, because Bathurst feels a little bit different now, hey? Yep. Yeah, you want to talk about that?
If I can, yeah, look, I think it's important to also mention that the Dyirribang project, the week of events, it was also about honouring the innocent bystanders, the innocent that died on all sides of the conflict. It wasn't just Wiradyuri and British that died. There was a lot of fallout, and we honour them too. You know, it wasn't their fault, and so they need to be remembered in this as well.
David, Leanna just made a beautiful statement that Bathurst feels a little bit different now. I was wondering if you could give us your reflections about the importance of events like Dyirribang and how you've seen the changing relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in the Central West.
Well, my experience of it is that, because I'm sort of just becoming a local, so it's like Bathurst, to me, it has changed. The beauty of it is now that there's a lot more interest in, like, the earlier history of Bathurst, and people, even my friends had no idea that there were Bathurst wars. And, when I'd sort of tell them with my history, and they go, oh, we had no idea that happened. And I said, well, that's what we're trying to get out. So to me, education is, like Leanna said, it's one of the most important things, that people actually understand that this happened. And I see it as one of my responsibilities with Windradine buried on Brucedale, that, that site's looked after, and, that if we can just spread the stories of what have happened to more people, so they actually understand that, it just wasn't a peaceful time, when Bathurst was colonised. So, there's a much greater recognition of what happened in the past now than what there has been for a long time. It's taken a bit to get it all going, but it is happening. So, and I think, with the schools being involved in it now, and I've had the Normanhurst Boys High School here this year. It's their second year that they've come up. They've got a teacher there who's very passionate about it. So there's 117, Year 7 boys that came to, Brucedale, and unfortunately it was the same week with Dyirribang, so we couldn't have the elders there. but I made sure that they knew how special that week was, that they were there, and their teachers very passionate about making sure that those kids were engaged while they were at home, and they actually did have good questions. So that's important. But, you know, like suddenly that's in Sydney, so there's 117 boys down here now who can probably say to their parents, oh, geez, you know, this happened in Bathurst. So, you know, that's the start of it. So even the local schools, I've got there's West Bathurst School where Leanna's got a program. It's not the students coming out, it's actually the teachers are coming out to Wiradyuri's grave in October, so they all have a better understanding of it. So if you get the teachers knowing about it, and they've actually coming to the gravesite, seeing the significance of it, it might just sort of make them realise how important it is to, you know, pass all these stories on and the truth on to their students. So it's a really important thing that's happening, and it's, yeah, I'm glad it's happening. It's a really good thing.
And Jeremy, as member of the Legislative Council in this our bicentenary year, what do you think we need to do as an upper house and as a parliament in order to continue to build this momentum into the future?
Well, we just need to do better, and part of that is because this institution, for all the good it's done, has also done a lot of harm, especially to First Nations people. And so we've got a responsibility to redress that, to acknowledge the harms done and tell the truth. So in the time that I've been in here, in this parliament, which is coming up for 15 years on and off, we've seen the acknowledgement of country at the beginning of every day. We've seen the Aboriginal Languages Act pass through, which was incredibly significant and a very powerful process, acknowledgement of how important it is to keep Aboriginal languages. We've seen the message stick as part of that placed in the Legislative Council, and I'd also acknowledge the fantastic work of yourself, Ben, in making sure that this bicentenary was a truth-telling process. The support you, the presiding officers and all the good officers of the Parliament have put into this seminar, also the incredible artworks, because they are they're a catalyst for a conversation, and not artworks, you know, in some alcove hidden away. Incredible Aboriginal artworks at the front of the building. The amazing new sculpture that was by Dinawan Yuan artist Alison Page, Rowena Welsh Jarrett and Simon Rees at the front of the building. Absolutely amazing. And just the unveiling yesterday of Ngara Jargon by Gumbanya Bunyalang woman Kim Healy, which was unveiled in the fountain. This incredible blue, just, you know, vibrant, living Aboriginal art. We have to keep fighting to tell the truth and fighting to make sure that Aboriginal history is and those issues are present in all our considerations.
Thank you.
Can I just add to all that?
Please.
You two pollies here. The one thing that needs to be done is that's good and fine to show all that. I'm going to do a bit of Gudyarra here. That's good fun. Yeah, but we don't want that to be just the tokenistic sort of stuff, because that's how we view some of this stuff. You know, when politicians and other people talk about putting all these Aboriginal paintings up and painting the plane or painting a train and all this sort of stuff to acknowledge Wiradyuri people or Aboriginal people, sorry. It's got to reflect in decisions that are made in this country, in this state particularly, you know, because there's a lot of development and other things that affect our people right across the state. And some of the consultation processes that take place are not right. You know, and I'll just be straight here, that the state government, and I worked in government, was always pushing people to go to and talk to land councils. Land councils are not traditional owners. They are a statutory body set up under an Act of Parliament, so they have to abide by those rules. They are not an authority. If they all read the legislation, they'd find out that they are not an authority. The traditional owners' knowledge has been ignored, even ridiculed, and that's coming from other Aboriginal people. And because of the way things are lobbied, and the way the consultation process is just about quickly ticking off to let that development go through. So there's got to be change to acknowledge that the lands where development's going to happen, it's going to have some sort of an impact. But talk to the people there to do it with their consent. Because this all goes back to Captain Cook when he came here. He didn't get consent to claim this continent for the British Empire, right? And that's why we're in the mess that we're in today. So we've got to fix up that mess, what those people did back then, to try and get us all living together and understanding each other. But like I said, a lot of this is going to come through with not just words or pictures and that. It's got to come through with action, being really being sincere about this. Because we, like I said, we're sat here and we've been open with you, and we've shared when you come on our country, because that's what Wiradyuri means. Wiradyuri means no having. So Wira is no, Jure is having. So when people come in our country, we had to go without to help share and welcome people in our country. And that's what we do every time people come to our place. We do that all the time because it's our responsibility to look after them both physically and spiritually. Yeah, and if these things keep going ahead, that's what makes us sick. And that's why we're always continually fighting. We always go to our place the next day and say, okay, what's the next battle today that we're doing? So it's just constant for us, and some of our people feel like giving up because they're just not seeing any results, and particularly when government is pitting Aboriginal people against Aboriginal people. And the way I see it with land council system, it's another form of dispossession because they're dispossessing the traditional people there by saying, all Aboriginal people can make a decision about this land. It's only traditional owners can speak for country, and that's the thing.
Yes, thank you so much, Uncle. I think a really important contribution. I am conscious of the time, but I want to ask Dr. Gaps the final question, and it's a pretty simple one. How do you see the future?
A simple one.
No pressure at all.
Look, as an historian, people say you can predict the future because you look back at the past and everything happens the same way as it. But I don't think that's the case. What I've seen the council do over 4 years in planning for this event is a shift from not even recognising that martial law was declared 10 days before the council to actually doing this and making these important steps. So if I take that as one area, and also the inspiration from the Dyirribang conference and events as a local example, it's been touted as an outstanding local example of a truth-telling event, organised locally. When I see those things happening, I see steps forward. And I see slow, incremental change. But as Uncle Bill said, there's a lot more to go.
Well, I think there's no better place to leave it than that. We've come a long way, but there is a long way to go. Can I thank everyone for attending what I am sure that you all agree was an absolutely fascinating conversation. To our panellists tonight, can I thank you particularly for your candour and your generosity in sharing your expertise and your personal experiences. To the New South Wales History Council for your partnership, to the many members of the council who are in attendance here tonight, and especially to Catherine Shirley, to Katrina Dubé and to Lauren Chater, thank you so much for your support in organising tonight's event. Thank you too to the Clerk of the Parliaments, David Blunt AM, the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, Helen Minikin, the Legislative Council's Usher of the Black Rod, Janelle Moore, and her entire team, the Senior Aboriginal Liaison Officer, Joe Stewart, and everyone at Parliament for all of their work behind the scenes to make this evening such a terrific success. This year, as we've commemorated the Legislative Council bicentenary, we've set the theme of reflect, celebrate, imagine. as we endeavoured to reflect on our past, celebrate our achievements, and imagine our future. And it's our hope that conversations like this one, the one that we've shared this evening, complete with compassion and truth-telling and honest collaboration, signal the type of democracy and the future that we are all committed to building. Thank you all for being here tonight.